I've been a Linux user for way too many years now. What I do is Linux. I record this show on Linux. I post this show on Linux, and then I use little Linux devices. Little Linux devices like this little guy, and I walk around running Linux. And when I'm not running Linux, I run FreeDOS because I am contrarian and I like to do weird things. But that's what I do. That's my life. But I'm still a nerd, so I have to expose myself to other things, right? I can't just live in my own little penguin-filled bubble all the time. I need to branch out. I need to break free. I'm not saying I need to go out and install, Windows, whatever we're at right now, but I still need to branch out a bit. And it has been forever since I've run any variant of BSD of any kind. NetBSDs and PCBSDs and FreeBSDs. I just haven't. And that, I think, is a failing on my part. But do I really need to try them? And I thought, you know what? I've got all these friends that swear by it. And they swear that I am morally inferior for my choice of Linux. And they're wonderful people. So you know what? I decided, I put a call out on Twitter last week sometime. I'm like, who would be the right person to convince me that BSD, FreeBSD, and various incarnations of it are the way to go? And they all pointed me to one individual guy, and that is George. What's your full name, George?
George Neville-Neil.
George Neville-Neil, which I should remember because we just talked about it 2 seconds before I started recording. But then my brain shuts off when I start recording a show and things just go south. George, why are you the guy to convince me of the beauty of FreeBSD?
I don't know why I'm the guy to convince you of the beauty of FreeBSD, but it would seem to be that I've become a FreeBSD salesman as well as a kernel developer and a writer of books and various other things on FreeBSD. Beautiful. So that's why everyone pointed you at me and me at you. So
it must be. What books have you written?
So I'm co-author with Marshall Cook-McCusick and Robert Watson of the design and implementation of the FreeBSD operating system. So it's an advanced operating systems book for, say, graduate students or people who work on operating systems.
Honestly, that book title alone does seem to qualify you to be on the show right now to convince me.
I guess it would.
All right. Okay. Let's just dive right into it. Let's lay this out here so you know the territory you're working with, right? So I mostly use Linux for absolutely everything. I predominantly use OpenSUSE for everything. I sit on the OpenSUSE board. That's what I do. That's my whole world, right? I use it on the servers. I use it on desktops. I use it on mobile devices. I use it on absolutely everything. Why would I consider dabbling with FreeBSD? Why would I change, say, my laptop or my desktop machine over to FreeBSD instead of another Linux variant?
Well, in terms of another Linux variant, so as a kernel developer, and I will state right up front, I believe in user space. I know that there is a user space. I know that there are programs that run in user space, but I wouldn't say that I write most of my code in user space. I spend most of my time in the kernel. It really, the choice of operating system, I think, comes down to a few things, and it depends on what you're doing with it, right? So I spend all day, every day, weekends as well, with my hands up inside the kernel like a brain surgeon, like a really clumsy brain surgeon. So, depending on what you do with the system, there are different ways in which we could talk about why it would be appropriate to use, FreeBSD specifically in your workflow. For me, it's because I'm building things around it. And when I look at, the kernel subsystems that I work with on BSD specifically, I do a lot of networking, TCP/IP, network device drivers. I've done a whole bunch of low latency, high performance networking work within the kernel. The architecture of that kernel is very attractive to me. I've spent too long, more than 20 years doing OS development. I've worked on embedded systems that are running around on Mars. I've worked on, large server systems like the BSDs. I've dealt with Linux. But if I would consider a place to be my home because of which code I like to use, it's the BSDs because of the architecture. How it's put together is really important. But that, to someone who's using it and consuming it, that probably doesn't matter, right? What you care about is, does my graphics driver work? And
Yeah.
can I plug in my disks? And what happens when I get the latest widget? Whatever that widget is.
I need widgets. I need them bad.
We all need widgets. So, going sort of upstack and not spending we don't want to spend a whole hour in the kernel, because you'll have 5 listeners for this particular.
You'd be surprised, program. Man.
Oh, okay, maybe 10.
We're pretty hardcore.
But if you're talking about things that are really interesting, sort of on a bigger level, you talk about servers. I think a lot of the more recent features, some of which come from other operating systems. We've been pulling in technologies from Solaris, now Lumos, and we've been pulling in developers from that community. ZFS has existed on FreeBSD for 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
And if you're running, if you want to run a big open source SAN environment, or, a big open source environment where you don't want to worry about what's going on in your RAID, and you just want the thing to work correctly, ZFS is just one of these really amazing features that we've had for a while. And I believe I can't remember if it's the SUSEs or one of the Linuxes is actually, Ubuntu is looking at shipping a ZFS, but there's licensing issues.
Yeah.
On the BSD front, and we'll talk about licensing later, with CDDL, which is what the Solaris stuff is, we can pull it in. So ZFS, really amazing. If you're doing software development, if you're doing rollouts, one of the less known features of ZFS, I think, at this point, for people who didn't come up in the Solaris world, is boot environments. So I do kernel development, which means at any moment I am about to blow my foot off. Especially when I do I run the head of our development tree on my laptop, right? And every week or so I upgrade, and I upgrade blindly. I look at the mailing list and check to see that no one is screaming that, oh my God, every device stopped working in the latest commit. But, I pretty much will just install the latest thing, because with boot environments, which take advantage of the copy on write features of ZFS, I can say, okay, snapshot everything, reboot into a new, not a clean space, but a space that wherever I dirty things, I can undo them automatically, install the kernel, install the world, reboot again. Oh, I did shoot my foot off. And in one reboot, I can be back where I was, right? So boot environments
is sort of like having in the end, sort of like having snapshots like with ButterFS or something like that for what you're trying to accomplish. I mean,
but it is. It's definitely taking advantage of the snapshots, but it's then got some things built around it that make managing them really easy. So, for me, I'm a kernel developer. Theoretically, I should be able to get myself out of trouble, because I should know what the heck I'm doing. But, if you think about running it on your mail server, or, a web server, an actual service you care about.
Yeah.
You look at companies like, companies that consume FreeBSD. You look at Gandhi, which is a big DNS provider and provider of virtual machines. They're based in Europe. They've switched all of their storage from expensive proprietary storage systems to generic servers running ZFS with FreeBSD on them, because of some of these features, right?
Right.
So I think ZFS is a huge thing, and people usually compare ZFS and ButterFS to each other as sort of in this. They target a similar market, but the ZFS code has been around since 2005, something like that, and has had a lot of development on it. It's really stable. There's a quote from one of the people I co-authored the D&I book, the Design and Implementation book, McCusick, who wrote the original fast file system and has worked on file systems for 35 years. And he points out that if you kernel someone's data once, they never trust you again. And so,
true.
Which is mostly true, although
true.
NTFS is kind of questionable. But, so if you look at the ZFS stuff, it's rock solid, right? You can just trust your data to it. And, a lot of us trust our data to it. I run it on a laptop. I run it on a single disk just because of the convenience I got it. So that's one of the, I think that's a really key feature.
Interesting. Okay. Then that does seem valuable. I think a lot of people, have similar things to that in some ways, but you're not the first person to tell me that ZFS or ZFS, depending on which part of the continent you come from, has those distinct advantages. So let's move on from that. Let's move on from the file system world. So So I'm sitting here in front of like FreeBSD, an open sourcey laptop, right? It's filled with open source goodness and a mixture of licenses, but mostly, GPL and GPL compatible stuff. Licensing. From a license perspective, what would make FreeBSD more appealing to me than Linux?
So again, this comes down to use case, right? So if you're an individual user and you are just running it on your laptop, you're not trying to build a product out of it. The GPL is, I would say, less harmful to you than it would be to a company. One of the things that the BSDs, and in particular FreeBSD, has been big on for the entire history of the operating system, which is unfortunately making me feel old and very long, has been the BSD license is super simple. When I've given a bunch of talks about the differences between Linux and FreeBSD,
yeah.
And I have these two slides. One of them has the entire GPL v2 on it, a slide, and the other has the BSD license as a slide. I can tell you which one you can read. And which one doesn't make the projector to like start to vibrate. The BSD license is really simple. So this is why people like Sony and Apple and Isilon now, EMC, Dell, NetApp, and Netflix, and all these other companies have been one of the reasons they've been willing to pick up the FreeBSD code as the basis for whatever product they're building.
Right.
And we really like to see FreeBSD in products. So, when you're building something and you want to ship it and you don't want to worry about a lawyer coming to ask you, by the way, where did you get that operating system? Honestly, sir, I picked it up on the street. It followed me home. You
don't want to have to deal with things like GPL compliance.
Exactly.
Okay. So let me take off my free software zealot hat just for a moment. I'm going to pretend.
Sure, I'll take off mine too.
I'm going to pretend like Richard Stallman's not going to hear this and yell at me later. Okay. The common argument here is that, well, of course, companies like that would choose the BSD license over the GPL license because they don't want to give back to the community and the world. They want to take the code and huddle it away in their dark, dark caves of evil corporatism. What would you say to that? What would you respond to that to someone who says that?
So, I mean, that's, so it's funny. I met Stallman when I was in college. I went to school in Boston, and I remember him talking about things like this. And all I could think was, if that's genius, I don't want to be that smart. But the fact of the matter is that until we come to the socialist utopia in which companies are no longer evil, there will always be companies. And from the BSD community standpoint, and you'll hear, I mean, I'm not the only person to say this, you get this out of a lot of people in the BSD communities generally. We don't want to deal with lawyers. I mean, some of my best friends are lawyers. It's probably not true. But I do know some lawyers.
It could be true.
It could be true. I mean, I will go to dinner with lawyers, but as a technologist, I don't want to have to deal with that. And the fact is the companies do give back. So Netflix has actually been really great. So Netflix has been doing some amazing work. They've got, they're serving 100 gigabits out of a single server. Their caching servers are running FreeBSD. That code is going up into FreeBSD. They're running the head of the tree, which I think is really amazing because most companies would never run the tip of development.
Right.
They're probably like three revisions behind the tip, but they're pretty close. They have been.
So they're kind of bleeding edge, yeah.
They are bleeding edge. But, all the companies that we know about give back. And actually, they give back for altruistic and non-altruistic reasons. So if you look at products built with any of these operating systems, you look at products built with Linux or FreeBSD or any BSD or, pick, like back when I worked on VxWorks at Wind River, the underlying code doesn't stand still, Linux or the BSDs.
Right.
And the reason that a lot of companies give back is if they give their patches back, then their massive diff that they have to apply when they go from FreeBSD 8 to FreeBSD 10, because they'll take 2 years to upgrade. They want that to be small because they don't want their engineers to run around, repatching everything that they did for 2 years and trying to figure out why there's 300,000 lines of diffs against all the drivers, right?
Right.
So some of it's altruism, some of it, there are, because of the way the license works, a significant number of the people in the community, and especially in the kernel team, what the Linux folks would consider the kernel team, work for these companies. So they're like, I just want my life not to suck in 2 years.
See, so it's for personal and well, selfish reasons. They want to be able to be as close to the main tree as possible, so they have as little work for themselves as possible. And that does make a tremendous amount of sense. Why then? Again, still pushing on this just a little bit.
Sure.
Why then do so many people, myself often included, get so worked up about the key difference here of GPL versus BSD in terms of licensing, of enforcing that the code is always free and available versus not enforcing it? Why do people get so worked up about it if really in your experience the companies are giving back, the companies are providing the code back as a general rule of thumb, then what do you think the harm is?
So, I mean, this is a conversation that many groups in open source have. Like if you look at LLVM, which is the compiler suite that we use, they're looking at they're not going to use GPL because that would be a disaster for them. But they are looking at licenses that will prevent them from being sued for patents. This is a more recent thing, for patents, that kind of protection. The original impetus for GPL, if you go back and you look at where it comes from, I always tell people they should read the last chapter of Stephen Levy's Hackers, right? Yeah. Where have you read the book?
Yep.
It was really, really formative to me. When I will tell you how old I am. I was 15 when I read that in hardcover.
Oh, geez.
It's a long time.
Yeah, it was a long time.
Yeah, so you look at what happened at the AI lab, and the people forming companies and taking the code and then really not giving it back, and you can see why the reaction would be like, we need a license that absolutely makes that impossible.
It mandatory.
Never again.
Yeah,
that's right. It's never going to happen again.
Yeah.
And
what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? Why not? Why not enforce that? What is the danger?
I think it's not realistic. And I mean, there are tons of companies which I could slander, who, everyone who works in open source has seen violations of GPL, right, in places. And we're like, okay, yeah, sure, we could, someone could get a hold of the Software Conservancy or someone like that, and there could be lawsuits. But, engineers, again, we're like, oh, God, really, do I have to go to court? Like, I don't want to be deposed. I've been deposed for court cases.
Yeah.
It's not fun.
It's not fun.
Right? So I think on the BSD side, I'd say there's a level of pragmatism around this. I mean, that's my personal view. It's like, okay, I would love people to be members of the community. I would love people to give stuff back. And, I do outreach around that. We'll, like, the way we found out that Sony put FreeBSD into the PS3 and the PS4, they asked some questions on a mailing list. And we're like, let me send you a private mail. By the way, are you using our operating system? And can we talk about that? And even Sony, which is a very secretive, interesting company to deal with, even they eventually, they came around, they put stuff back in, and it's a process. And I think, to be honest, that people who believe the GPL V to V3, which is even more restrictive, or
it prevents the TiVoization.
Yes, that was,
I'm a GPL V2 man. I love V2. V2 is my boy.
V2 is less crazy. Did you look at the original version?
Don't
of V3?
sugarcoat it. Oh yeah. No, yeah, I was covering version 3 as it was going through all the process. Yeah.
Yeah, you're like, oh wow, and I could see why Linus was like, nope, we're not going that far.
2 works. Let's stick with 2.
2 works for them. But I think there's I think in a certain hardcore level of people believing that GPL v2 works, I think they're kind of deluded, right? It's like, unless how are you going to get Cisco, right? I mean, if you get hardcore evidence and you've got many, many millions of dollars, maybe you can get something out of them, but they'll probably buy you off. And who wants to spend that time that's engineer time, right? Like that's hours where we could be building code.
Yeah. I mean, it is a lot. And the couple of groups out there, like the Free Software Conservancy and whatnot that you mentioned, they already don't have the resources and the time to enforce GPL compliance on all the many people that are out there that are probably in violation of it. That's true.
Right. And the funny is, again, the wrong word, but I use it a lot. The funny thing is that every time there's like some significant enforcement of GPL, we get more FreeBSD developers. Because people are just like, I don't want to deal with this. I'm going to go play with those nice people who promised not to sue me. And so I just think that I understand the impetus for GPL. I understand that thing where people are like, no, I'm working, I'm a volunteer. I want other people to recognize that volunteerism, but I just don't have time, right? It's like, from a license standpoint, I just don't want to care about that. I mean, I remember when when people still did things with public domain licenses. You were in public domain.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right. I put this in the public domain. All of my software before I ever met the BSD folks was public domain. Sure. Like all that stuff. Because it was just like, okay, how can I put something on this that makes sure that I can write code and people never ask me a legal question?
Right. I don't have to deal with it. It's out of my hands. Exactly. It's just owned by anyone. It's fine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was gonna write this anyway. If I was going to build something that I thought was proprietary and important, I would start from scratch, and I could do that, right? I mean, that's what OS developers do, but I don't feel the need to do that.
Okay.
If I'm doing something, it's volunteer, then please have at it.
Okay. We might come back to this very briefly, but let's move into, let's assume desktop user. Casual desktop user, let's assume my needs are very straightforward. I need a good, nice graphical desktop, boots up, looks kind of pretty, runs a good web browser, nice office suite, ready to rock and roll. Are there any benefits to using FreeBSD over any various Linux distro in that space?
So I think there are. I mean, one of them is, you'd like your desktop to be running something that has really stable storage, right? So people talk about Btrfs now. Btrfs is not production ready. It's hobbyist ready. If you're willing to, make sure you got backups and stuff, I would still be a little nervous about Btrfs. ext4 seems to be a little more, that's tried and tested. But I definitely, I'm a big fan of not ever losing my data. So it's just how I am.
I don't think you're going to find many people that disagree with that statement. Yeah.
Well, there are people who are willing to be at the bleeding edge where they're like, every once in a while I just have to do a backup from something.
I don't want to lose my data. I mean, I keep my data, I keep offsite backups. I'm so paranoid about losing some of this stuff. So, I mean, I get it. So
there's some of that.
Okay.
So there's some of that. Then I think, people can argue about package managers till they're blue in the face. I think at this point, many of the package managers are relatively simple. And for a while, the FreeBSD package manager wasn't very good. The new package manager is great. We've got the snapshots. They get updated. People get updates. I think that works really well. I think that from a security standpoint, you've got some features on FreeBSD that would be interesting to people who were trying to secure a desktop.
Okay.
You've got things like
my tinfoil hat is huge, so you can probably sell me on this item. So what do you got?
So if you look at the newer things going into FreeBSD, which is something called Capsicum, it's based on capability research. This is being used to basically do, really fine-grained, high-performance sandboxing.
Okay.
Right. So you'll start seeing that in a lot of stuff. Being able to keep your web browser from poking into things. And actually, that's another technology that winds up in things like Mac OS, right? So that's stuff that they've taken. So, and then you've got, the Mac auditing framework. If you're doing development work on your desktop, dtrace, right? Like this is one of the other main technologies we got from the Illumos and Solarix folks. If you really want to understand what's going on a system, dtrace is amazing. We actually teach at this point because we can give the students a really broad view of what's going on in the system. So dtrace is a really, great tool there. But, are you going to wind up with like Emacs is Emacs, right? Or VI or NVI or Vim,
right?
Or Firefox 56.32.3. They exist on on all those
yeah.
systems. Right. And, from that standpoint, I think it's kind of a wash.
Okay, that's a fair statement. I mean, and honestly, I would expect it to kind of be a wash, right? I mean, once you get above the kernel level and the file system level and all the system side of things, and you get into full-on user space stuff, you're kind of, I mean, really, you can kind of run a lot of the same stuff. I mean, what desktop environment are you using right now?
So on my laptop, I run FreeBSD a ton on servers and little tiny embedded systems. We teach with embedded. And then my laptop's a Lenovo X260, which is, I'm using i3.
Oh.
Which is a super minimalist.
Yeah.
And all keyboard based.
i3 is all right. I'm more of an X-Monad or awesome guy myself, but I can
Monad's nice.
I can respect i3 as long as you're not running rat poison. You and me can still be friends. So
what I want is minimal window decoration, please. No bling.
I am too. Yeah, I just I like my applications to be the bling. If I really want a lot of really cool stuff going on, I will launch an application that does cool stuff. Thank you very much. But so when you meet other FreeBSD users, what are they running? I mean, is there a de facto desktop environment that just dominates the FreeBSD world?
So for the desktop, I mean, whatever PCBSD is doing at the moment is the desktop environment. I know that first of all, they changed their name to TrueOS, and right, I think they've just because why? And I think they may have just changed the desktop environment because I'm running head on my laptop. So PCBSD is relatively close to head, but it's meant for users, not kernel developers.
Right.
For me, I'm actually building new kernels and writing new code on my laptop.
You're on the FreeBSD side, yeah.
Yeah. So I stay on the FreeBSD side. And the TrueOS stuff is the closest thing to a distro, like a desktop distro that we have in the BSD world, FreeBSD world.
Are they running? Was it KDE that they had going on for a long time?
They were for a while, but I think they've switched to something else. And now we're all looking at Wayland, right? So there's Wayland support coming. So we'll see what happens with that.
Whoa. So I mean that is kind of interesting. I mean that's because most Linux distros are doing the exact same thing. Like a few of them have started adopting Wayland, and the rest of them are like maybe soon. It's one of those deals. Okay.
I'm trying to figure out what the advantage of that is, right? I mean, I've been using X since it was X10 when I was in college.
Yeah.
So I'm like, it just works.
I think it's more a matter of there's a whole lot of old code. Let's start from scratch and build up compatibility around it. And I go back and forth myself about whether that makes sense at all or is an awesome idea. I'm not really decided. Okay. So if I'm a casual desktop user, really basically the same simple graphical applications are available on both. I'm going to have Firefox, going to have LibreOffice, et cetera, right?
Yep.
Do you find in running FreeBSD, because I'm assuming you've dabbled enough on the Linux side of things to just kind of at least know what's available?
I will admit that when I have to run Linux, I run Ubuntu mostly or Debian. Sorry.
Debian's cool. All right, I respect Debian.
If a client, so I do consulting. If a client is like, we got to run this thing on Linux, we need a thing, and I'm like, okay, 5 minutes to get Ubuntu in a VM.
That's fine.
And just fire it up.
That's fine. Do you find on the FreeBSD side that you're ever wanting for something? Like, is there ever a point where you can't accomplish something, or you wish you could accomplish something that seems to be available elsewhere?
So what you used to find, and again, this is going to be a sort of a more hardware software interface thing. The software is always run. I mean, it's all POSIX, right? It's like, okay, well, I can't run the official JDK. I have to run OpenJDK because Oracle and licensing. But everybody has that problem.
Same thing.
And I've got OpenJDK 8, so whatever, it's fine. It used to be the case when hardware manufacturers were, they would randomly pick another chip mid-production of the same box, and there would be more drivers on the Linux side than on the BSD side. You're like, now I have to update my driver to do this thing that Linux already does because someone was paid at Red Hat to fix it, blah, blah, blah. So it was that kind of thing. But now, like if you look at, okay, so, maybe if you're trying to run it on a Chromebook, whatever. But, any laptop you're going to go down to the store and buy, they've all got the same 8 chips. right?
That's true.
Everything's on the
is
CPU
true.
now.
Yeah.
It's not like, it's like, oh, it has an Intel i210. Everything has an Intel i210 or, whatever. So, I mean, I remember one of the things, so I actually do dual. I actually run on a Mac and I run on the FreeBSD box. And the Mac uses FreeBSD as for a lot of its components, so it's close enough that it doesn't piss me off. Because that was my test. That was my.
Will this piss me off?
Yeah, so I went and bought a Thai book years ago, and before there were Apple stores, in this really snooty Apple store, where they're like, "Well, of course you'd run Apple." I'm like, "Shut up! Show me the laptop." And it was not annoying. It was okay enough that I was willing to use it. But the point is that one of the reasons I started doing that is on the server side, I didn't have to rewrite every network driver. Right, I'm a network guy, and every laptop was like. Seriously, like it's a 3-com card, which is now a 3C59 whatever,
right.
Which doesn't work. And that was one of the ones where Linux, because it had a broader base, was ahead, where it's like, oh, well, yeah, that driver's already been ported to Linux. It may not be the best port, like it's their first port, but it at least passed packets. So that was the thing where I'd be like, ugh. But now, like it's funny, almost all you go to a BSD developer conference, or actually any high-level conference, and you see two things. You see Lenovo Dell running Linux or BSD.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of glowing apples.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's that one guy in the corner who's spent his entire life in his parents' basement, porting every single driver to some obscure laptop made in Japan in 2001 that he loves, which is great. Yeah. All power to him. I have friends like that.
Yeah.
But I don't want to spend my life doing it.
Same. Okay.
So the hardware is converged now, where it's no longer as much of a problem. It's like, I went from I've always done the Lenovo's because the keyboards suck less, and you can usually replug the hard drive. They're making things harder to replug, which is going to eventually probably drive me off.
I'm sensing a real theme with you. It's whatever pisses me off the least.
Exactly.
That seems to be what you gravitate towards. I respect that.
As an engineer, that's our only choice, right? Nothing ever really works. We don't get to have nice things. So our goal is okay. What's the thing that's not going to make me so upset that I won't be able to do this?
What's going to make me the least stabby? I get you.
Yeah, the least stabby. But when I went to the 260, I actually put in I put a 1 terabyte flash in it. I'm like, okay, this is going to be my my main laptop. Moved all my music over, moved everything over, and it was. I think it's kind of sad that as open source people, I don't know if you have this experience, but I've had this experience from time to time where it's like, okay, I'm really familiar with the kernel and the bits of the kernel that I know about, and I know they'll just work. And then you're like, I wonder if sound works. Or I wonder if, this thing that I never use on like server applications or things that I'm building around, I'm like, how does sound work? Oh, it works really well. Yeah, it's nice. Someone fixed that. So that's been my experience, especially in the last few years, where the hardware's converged. There aren't, there used to be 100 or maybe not 100, but like 50 sound cards.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, oh, do I have the FooBar sound card made by these guys on week 5, and does that work?
I can't recall the last time I saw like an ad-lib sound card or something like that.
Right, exactly.
Things have gotten a lot more simple in that regard. Just changing gears slightly, because I'm trying to get my head around everything from a performance standpoint. So like resource usage and performance. Have there been any studies done around, and I'm sure there have, or do you have any personal anecdotal like examples of the difference between FreeBSD and Linux or other systems when it comes to speed, memory usage, etc.? Like how do those two really compare at this point?
So performance, I mean, actually the one, well, it's been a few years now, but the one really good one on this, if you want to look at that kind of thing, is there's a really good set of Postgres white papers where, someone's like, oh, Linux crushes BSD. And then one of our kernel developers is like, oh yeah, you just change those 5 lines. Now it's fine. Because, it always goes back and forth.
Yeah, it always does.
But if you look at, the classic example now is network performance. This is the reason people like Netflix are using FreeBSD in their device. Not just they can use the BSD license. They're putting out 100 gigabits, or they're putting out 90 gigabits on a 100 gigabit card, right? So, the performance there for TCP performance is just really good. And some of that is because it's supported by the hardware, but, that's also mixing in how it's supported by the operating system.
Okay.
So you look at network performance, we do really well. If you look at disk performance, it really depends on your workload, but we're really sensitive. We as a community are sensitive to the LAMP FAMP stack, right? How MySQL, et cetera. So the performance, thing, the graphs go up and down, and then when someone's like, oh, hey, in release foobar, we screwed this up, and that's on both sides, right? Like, sometimes Linux is better, sometimes Linux is worse.
It changes quite a bit. So what I kind of hear is they're roughly comparable. Is really what I'm hearing. Other than the network performance, kind of seems to be the feather in the cap on the FreeBSD side.
Well, I know the networking side better, so that's the part I'm going to know.
So
about.
You're focused on that. I got it.
I am focused on that. On the file system performance side, I mean, you look at the performance of something like a ZFS. That's going to be using a Z or ZFS backed MySQL or Postgres.
You can say it either way. It's cool.
You're going to. Well, the problem is that the guy who did the port is Polish. So every presentation I ever saw on ZFS was Pavel, who's a brilliant developer, saying, and I ported ZFS. I'm like, oh, I guess it's Zed from now on. Anyway,
it's interesting. Almost every BSD user I know, and I know a lot of them, are Canadian. It just like bar none. They either tend to live in Ontario or British Columbia, and there's a lot of them. And I don't know what that is. Is it like a regional thing? Like where are you from? What region are you?
I'm actually from New York.
Oh. Well, that just doesn't make any sense at all then.
But
you're
the problem
skewing the stereotypes I'm trying to impart.
I'm breaking the American stereotype. I know about other languages like Zed. Anyway, so you look at the performance of something like ZFS or the UFS performance if you're using smaller sets of disks.
Yeah.
And the performance is comparable. Like, I mean, what performance is usually measured against now is performance of the hardware.
Right.
As long as we're within a few percentage of what the hardware theoretically can do, then
you're good to go. Yeah.
Right. And that's what everybody's going to aim at. That's what Linux is going to aim at. That's what I guess Windows might aim at something.
Who knows?
Who knows?
Notice we don't have someone from Microsoft on the show to debate this with us.
That's true.
Yeah.
So, it's always trying to get to the speed of the hardware. And we're definitely there with that. And, if you look at one of the ways in which I think performance on the BSDs has excelled is, and there's a really good paper on this, a lot of the things that the Linux folks tried to do to make NUMA work, right? Non-uniform memory access, you've got multiple processors, they don't actually have a front-side bus anymore. And I actually ran into this, in my last full-time gig, where, you get a piece of hardware from Intel and you're like, okay, I've got 28 cores. It's like, 14 of those are less useful than the other 14 because they can't actually talk to the hardware devices. But there was a really good paper on 10 years of the Linux folks really trying to make NUMA automatic and fast, and they didn't. And it turns out the right answer, which we didn't get because we're smarter, we got because we were, I wouldn't say lazy, but we didn't have the time to do it, was really dumb allocation. Right? It's like, first touch actually works because all of the other attempts at guessing what the application wants to do turn out to be lower performance.
Interesting.
So massive multi-core things on modern hardware. The BSDs tend to outperform Linux because the scheduler and the memory allocator are actually just simpler. Right? Simplicity won the day on that one. Yeah.
Huh. So, all right. Realistically, then, where I'm at right now is I'm looking at this. Nothing you say sounds objectionable. Not in the slightest, right? I'm hearing good things, and I see some benefit, and I've been beaten over the head with the ZFS stick for years now, and I agree. It does seem like there's some distinct benefits there, and there's some cool tools around it. But putting that off to the side, the reality is, again, I've got a Linux machine in front of me. I've got a Debian machine over there, OpenSUSE machine here. There's Linux distros all around me, and no data loss for years and years and years. Been reliable, been consistent, been high performance, with the one exception coming from a very Unity-focused distribution off to my side. But everything else has been very high performance, been solid, it's been great, fairly low memory usage, things crack along. And I'm coming up short when I'm trying to figure out a reason to pivot even one of my machines over to FreeBSD or PCBSD, I see the ZFS as being cool. That's high-fiveable. If I ran a gigantic server cluster and I needed high TCP/IP throughput and I needed a file system like ZFS, I can see a benefit there. But outside of that, I don't know that I see the benefit. And that said, I also don't know that I see the harm. I'm looking at FreeBSD and I'm thinking, oh, this has most of everything I want, and the Debian machine and the OpenSUSE machine have most of everything I want, and they all look pretty good. So I guess what I'm confused by is, since clearly FreeBSD is a stable, mature, powerful system, just like Linux is, why does it not get the press time and the airtime of its penguiny counterpart? What is that?
So there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, I'm sort of like reasoning about them. And one of the ones is timing, right? So, the Linux stuff really hit, the market, for want of a better term, at the time that the BSDs were all tied up in a lawsuit, right, with AT&T. If you actually look at, there's this great graph that McKusick does when he talks. He does a history of BSD talk, because Kirk's been working on BSD since before there was free, open, or net, like the BSD at the university.
I have to point this out because other people will point it out to me as well. Because we just started bringing up lawsuits, and when we started, we were talking very heavily about wanting to avoid lawsuits on the BSD side of things. So there's a little
very important. Never make your phone number 1-800-ITS-UNIX as a company. It turns out that will result in AT&T, when AT&T was AT&T, sending very expensive lawyers in very nice suits to come visit you.
All right, so lesson learned: never use that phone number.
Never use that phone number. But at the time, this is the early '90s, when Linus was putting out his early releases and fighting with Andy Tannenbaum. The BSD folks, the BSDs had not really escaped the university yet. So when the lawsuit, AT&T amazingly lost the lawsuit, because it turns out the Regents of California also have very expensive lawyers in expensive suits, and they had slightly cleverer lawyers. So once the BSDs were actually released from the university and then started being real full systems, if you look at a pair of graphs of growths of community, growths of adoption, the BSDs basically follow on, right? But the first mover advantage, right? Linux has totally the first mover advantage. It's got the name recognition. It's it's been picked up by people like IBM.
From an alternative sense of the word, you could point at it and say, well, FreeBSD is a free BSD, and I've heard that those were around for a while. I'm not sure who told me that, but I've heard they've been around a while. So shouldn't BSD, any variant, have the name recognition, at least in the big corporate and telecommunications and whatnot spaces? Shouldn't it be the giant? Shouldn't people be looking at that and going, yeah, that's what we're going to move to as we move away from what we're using from Bell Labs? Shouldn't we be focusing on something like FreeBSD? Wouldn't that be the natural progression?
So there is one other real disadvantage, I think, in the BSD community, and a bunch of us have talked about this from time to time. There's no Red Hat. Right?
Oh, I got you.
So, there are companies, IX Systems and other companies, that do sell support.
The success story. Yeah.
But it's not just a success story. Banks like to buy insurance, right? So I live and work in New York. I've worked on Wall Street. You go to a Morgan Stanley or, another bank, and you're like, hey, I've got this really awesome high performance operating system. It's got these features. And, I don't know, most people don't know this, but everyone at a bank is a vice president, because that's how they can use their cards in bars to pick people up. So some vice president, which means actually some low level clown, will be like, well, yeah, but it's free. How can I can't sue someone if it doesn't work, and I can't pay someone for support. And that, The Red Hat model, I think, really helps the Linux community quite a bit. The SUSEs and the OpenSUSEs and the other distros and the Ubuntus and whatever Debians, they're, for technologists, they're great. Like, we can make a decision among those, right? Because we know how computers sort of compute in that thing. But if you want to know why it's not used, why the BSDs are less, actually, it turns out there's a huge amount of BSD hidden within banks, which is amusing. But if you want to talk about why, all the servers at a Morgan Stanley or something are running Linux, they went probably from AIX, God help them, to Solaris to, Linux. The reason is because they can, for $2,000 per CPU per year, pay someone insurance money, right? And, we can argue about whether or not that's of value because we're engineers. But yeah, that's a huge advantage for a system. And then I think the other thing is, having had a few large companies pick it up, right? So IBM, HP, people who actually deploy large numbers of machines.
Big companies, yeah.
They once the Linux was in there, that's what they're going to stick with. They're not going to, they have then bought companies that built products around BSD.
Now looking at it, just looking back on the history of it. So Linux really didn't hit 1.0 until 92, something around there.
Yep.
Right after that, actually right before Linux hit 1.0, SUSE became a company and started doing its business. A year and a half or 2 years later, Red Hat came along and started doing its thing. And so really, even if we just look at those two companies, right? Two little fly-by-night, Linux-y, engineering-y focused companies came along and they began doing a lot of business on the Linux side. And, both became large and Red Hat became Red Hat. It's been a long time. FreeBSD's been around. I look at that and I'm like, why is there not the company? Like if I were purely a CTO at a company and I was totally platform agnostic, like I just didn't give a poo which hardware, which software we're using, I just want it to work. And like you were saying, if I want to know, I could find someone to sue, I would look around and I'd say, okay, great, Linux, great, I got SUSE, I got Red Hat, I got Canonical, I can come after those guys. And when I would look at FreeBSD, I would have to stop and say, why is there not a SUSE or a Canonical or a Red Hat on the FreeBSD side that I can point at? To me, if I were the CTO, that would suggest to me a deficiency. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is one, but that's what it was. If I didn't look into it any further, I would be like, well, clearly something's wrong in this world, because if it hasn't happened by now, this must be an inferior product, right? Mm-hmm. That's how I would look at that. Not because it necessarily even is,
right?
But so why hasn't it happened?
So I think there's a timing issue. The reason Red Hat is Red Hat isn't just they picked up Linux or whatever, but
agreed.
First bubble, right? They made a ton of money that way, and then they didn't have quite such a ton of money anymore. Because
they're doing great now. They're
back.
Red Hat's doing great. SUSE's doing great. They're making tons of money. They're doing lots of sales. Canonical, who knows? Because a guy from outer space is still funding them. Right?
But there you go.
Yeah.
But I think the reason you don't find it, the reason we don't find that in the FreeBSD world at the moment is also user base. So, I think Red Hat helped generate a user base of people who are going to deploy it on servers and data centers, things like that. The user base still for FreeBSD, if you're talking about devices, or you're talking about, but let's talk about installed base, which is what we used to call it.
Yeah.
Right. So here's your installed base, right?
Now
every iPhone has FreeBSD in it.
But not all FreeBSD though. Like it's like a subset of like the pieces and parts, right? Because it's a different.
It's the kernel.
It's not. Isn't iOS based is all Darwin-y?
It's Darwin-y, which is BSD plus Mach. Mach is CMU's research operating system that ran a bunch of BSD
the Mach
stuff.
microkernel, yeah.
And they've been removing as much Mach as possible.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if you're talking about installed base, PS3, PS4, iOS devices, Mac laptops.
There's a lot of those.
And there's a ton of those. But they don't come up and go, welcome to FreeBSD. They come up and go, welcome
Right.
to PS4 or PS3
Exactly.
or things like that.
It's
So the BSDs,
underlying architecture, really.
Yep.
I mean, you're talking about basically then FreeBSD is an underlying architecture project or series of projects then at that point. And is that good or bad? I mean, is that from your standpoint, is that how it should be, or do you feel like there should be FreeBSD recognition and people should be installing and using FreeBSD, gosh darn it? Like, how do you want to see it? What should it be?
The thing that's most important to me from that standpoint, I mean, let's face it, if I'm going to talk to a non-technical user about what operating system they should run, I'm not going to give them FreeBSD or Linux. I'm going to give them macOS because, sorry, it's the one they are likely to call me about later.
Right? Those words that came out of your mouth killed at least 4 fairies. They died because you said that.
They died. Their wings fell off. But I mean, seriously, like I love my laptop, right? I really like my FreeBSD box, I say this, and I say this to FreeBSD kernel developers. I insult them to their face. I'm like, you know what? We suck at user interfaces. We suck at usability. We are not the people to make devices for human beings. We are the people to make devices for engineers,
sure,
and people who want to build more devices. But like, I edit all my code in Emacs, and I edit other files in VI. I do not give Emacs to the random user of a laptop.
No, but you know, like Emacs doesn't even come pre-installed on most Linux distributions.
Okay, so would you give them VI? Like you're going to give?
Oh hell no, I'm not giving them VI. But just the same, I would feel comfortable giving them LibreOffice or the Calligra suite or a variety. Well, maybe a little less on the Calligra suite depending on the build. But you know what I'm saying? There are great graphical tools, and there are millions and millions of desktop Linux users right now. Millions and millions of them. And they're not like you and me. At least not all of them. We're nerds. We're engineers. We came from that world. That we're a little different.
But you do know what most of the people in the world really are interfacing with, right?
Just a web browser.
Windows.
Yeah,
they're almost all still running Windows. I'm sorry.
I know.
Billions of Linux desktops, and there may only be thousands of FreeBSD desktops. We are dwarfed by the worst operating system ever written with a pretty face. And it's not even a pretty face.
I don't disagree with you in the slightest on any of that.
Right? So here's the thing for me, for people using FreeBSD on a desktop, and why I want to see more FreeBSD on the desktop, and why I do things like I teach classes.
Lay it on me.
CS theory classes, CSOS classes around BSD, because we need more developers, right? The thing that desktop usage and easy install of a Linux gets the Linux community is, 100 people in some high school are going to run Linux, and 3 of them are going to be competent coders, and the other 97 should go do something else, which is great. The world needs more other people.
Great, yeah.
But the fact that the first exposure for people is going to be a Linux means that they're going to know Linux. They're going to want to, they go on to work at that bank. They're going to be like, I used Linux in high school.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's where things like getting people exposed to FreeBSD is important. It's not, would I be amused or terrified to walk into a bank and see every machine, every desktop running FreeBSD? I'd be happy to know that. I'd be
excited about it. I don't even use FreeBSD, and it would thrill me because at least you've got an open source system, right? I mean, I'm a free software guy. I am. As crazy as Richard Stallman can be sometimes,
and he can be crazy,
and he can, and there's YouTube videos that I have made fun of just like everyone else along those lines. But on this, he and I are in lockstep. I'm big on the free software side of things, but I also see the BSD license and the open sourciness that FreeBSD provides as being a great net positive for the world. It's not a negative, it's not hurting something because you guys are providing source code for an amazing system.
Sure.
Would I like to see a slightly different license? Yeah, but honestly, I can say the same of people who are using GPL v3. I think they should use v2. But I'm looking at that, and I would love to see more of that in the banks. At least then they're not using OS2 Warp 3 anymore. Or you know what I mean? There are distinct benefits. And I look at FreeBSD, and it seems like FreeBSD is consistently Linux's little cousin. in the minds of people. And it's Linux's little cousin is smart. Linux's little cousin is almost exactly the same size as Linux. Like in the end, they stand about the same height. They're both good looking. They go about things a little bit differently. One's more libertarian and one's more progressive. You know, like their politics vary a little tiny bit. But otherwise, there's a lot of similarities from a technical standpoint. And I can't figure out, outside of the ethical licensing related issues, what reason someone would have to use one over the other at this point, other than install base size. And so, if someone's not terribly concerned about the ethical issues relating to either BSD or GPL licensing, then going with the install base size is, you know, Linux kind of wins there, because for whatever reason, it got big and huge. I still can't figure out a reason for me to put FreeBSD on something other than I'm a nerd and I want to play with it anyway. And that's probably going to happen. The reality is I'm going to use my cheap little Lenovo laptop and I'm going to put FreeBSD on it after we talk, because I want to tinker around with it. But unless I madly fall in love with it, I can't figure out a reason to use it over using Linux other than licensing.
So there are other things I think that we haven't really touched upon. One of the things that FreeBSD is big on is, so in the Linux world, you have distributions and you have the kernel, right? So you're an OpenSUSE guy, or you run a bunch of stuff, you know, OpenSUSE or Debian, you know, various CentOS, whatever, you know, the distro of the week, Mint.
Yeah.
You know, it's very interesting when I go into a Linux environment for like a client and I'm like, wow, you're running 3 distros. I hope all the kernels are the same. Anyway, but in the FreeBSD world, I always say I hope. But in the FreeBSD world, we deliver you a whole system. There's no, I mean, PCBSD is a distro in a way. TFSense, which is a router, a firewall and router system, is a distro in a way because they package a bunch of stuff automatically with it. But, you know, especially as a developer, and this is what the BSDs were always targeted as, you know, 20 years ago when they started. You know, as a developer, I install FreeBSD and everything I expect to be there is there. NFS is there, and you know, all of the compilers and the development tools. The first thing you do when you install half of the distros that I've dealt with personally is, oh yeah, you want to do some actual work, then you want to go install 9 packages.
Isn't that more of a variance of there just simply not being a mountain of FreeBSD distributions? Because I mean, if there were a bunch of different distributions of FreeBSD, wouldn't the same sort of scenario come into play?
No, because FreeBSD, so that's, and I think this is one of these things that it's often hard for me to explain. When you say FreeBSD, we mean the whole thing. We mean user space, we mean all the tools, and we mean the kernel. And often when people say Linux, especially if they say Linux instead of GNU Linux, if they say just Linux, they mean the kernel. But if they say Ubuntu, they mean the kernel and some stuff and a package manager.
And Debian, and then whatever Canonical puts on. Yeah,
exactly. And then, you know, whatever, because they're usually, the distros in particular are very sort of like, you know, like there was a big deal when Ubuntu decided to change its desktop environment, right?
Sure was.
Right. Everybody, I believe there were pitchforks and tar and feathers. And
fire coming out of my ears.
There you go. But because FreeBSD comes from kind of a world before everyone cared about the graphical in a way, you know, when we say FreeBSD, we mean the whole thing. So when I install FreeBSD on a server, I generally don't have to do anything else. Right. I mean, I then will, you know, start writing code, or I'll grab something that I need. But to do my development, to do my job, I don't have to add anything. Everything's there to do the job of running a server, running a desktop, or, you know, doing, and in particular, we're doing software development.
But realistically, I could come along and say, hey, FreeBSD looks like a nice base for Brian OS. I'm going to take that and I'm going to begin modifying. I'm going to add packages. I'm going to take packages away that I don't like.
Sure.
And eventually I come up with a distro that is built on FreeBSD, but then it becomes my own thing. So then if people ask me, well, what is Brian OS? They're like, well, it's FreeBSD with changes. And
with these 5 packages.
Right. So realistically, then it kind of becomes this same sort of thing as the GNU/Linux based distributions, right? I mean, because it's variations. Like it's the difference between Debian and Mint. I mean, technically, Mint is based on Debian, at least at some lineage in the line, but they are very different beasts, sort of. So, and then it can end up running with different versions of kernels and different versions of all sorts of packages, even if they come out at the same time, and then they can start branching off into crazy directions, and that can be an issue. But it seems like an issue that FreeBSD could just as easily have if there was more of an ecosystem in place.
So I think the reason we don't have that is that the FreeBSD project, the team of 300 source developers plus 1,000 or so ports developers, we focus, I wouldn't say narrowly, but we definitely focus on, FreeBSD 10 is, or 11 or 12. We've got 11 out now. We're working on 12. And FreeBSD 11 is these things, and we're not going to break them. And actually, this is a really interesting point, especially for people who have to deal with multiple systems on top of their system.
Yeah.
So we will not break a kernel ABI between minor releases. Okay. So if you have 11.0 and 11.1 and 11.2 and 11.3 and something worked on 11.0, it will work on 11.1. We will not release 11.1 if it will break something that worked on 11.0 until that is fixed. And
that's good.
That for software development in particular, and for people rolling out software, is really helpful. Like if you look at, and I'll come back to like the appliance development style people, like the people who are building NetApp filers who build on FreeBSD, or the Isilon devices built on FreeBSD, or Juniper routers also built on FreeBSD. They know that they can build a new version within the main change, right? Like, well, between 11 and 12, we can break things. You're going to have to suck it up. But 11.0 to 11.1 to 2 to 3 or whatever, however many releases we have in that chain, we're not going to break it. Now, as a desktop user, that's good. We won't break your drivers. Firefox won't act weird because suddenly we changed the way shared memory worked or some insanity. Not that anyone would ever do that.
No, that wouldn't happen.
That wouldn't happen. But it wouldn't happen with us, right? And so that whole system,
I gotcha.
That whole system idea, results in a system that is coherent. Right. And so that's why I say it's like, when I install FreeBSD, I'm ready to go. Now, young people might argue that, yes, Grandpa, your C and C++ compiler are there, but, what about Rust? And then it's like, well, okay, fine. If you want Rust, go get a package, youngster, which is fine. I like Rust. I program in Rust.
It's a good throw out to the Rust developers out there. You gotta pat their head a little bit, otherwise they get uppity, man. All right,
Rust, go. They're interesting.
All right,
but they're not in base.
You mentioned very briefly, and we'll kind of bring this to kind of a head here.
Sure.
You mentioned very briefly like people building appliances and the like, right?
Yep.
And I can see if I was an appliance manufacturer, the attractiveness of using FreeBSD with its license over using Linux with its license. There is a distinct attractiveness if I'm that sort of a company and I'm developing those sorts of devices, right? Here's my concern. So we live in the age of Internet of Things coming out of our ears, right? Okay,
yes.
So my refrigerator, my toaster, the guy down the street, they're all going to be running some sort of operating system, and they're all going to have their own IP address, which isn't going to cause a problem at all. And all of that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those devices will be running Linux, and some of them will be running FreeBSD, and some of them will be running something really stupid. So let's just look at the FreeBSD and Linux ones for a minute. So I've got two toasters in my house. One's running Linux and one's running FreeBSD. The Linux one with a full GPL stack, mostly top to bottom, right? Which requires them to be then any changes they make to publish it. So, or at least on request. So the nice part about that from my end user standpoint, purely end user standpoint, is that from a security point of view, I can then know exactly what sort of code my toaster is running. And I know that seems like a silly thing for most people to want, but for someone like me who's a little bit concerned about the fact that I now have 27 unattended headless computers that are servers running in my house connected to my network all the time, I want to know what they are. I want to know what they're running. I want to know what they're doing. With FreeBSD, they don't have, with the BSD license, they don't have to show that code. They can make whatever changes they want, and I don't ever have any recourse to get that code. That to me is mildly terrifying. The idea that I wouldn't have that code. Don't you want that code? Don't you want to see that, man? Like, if I get saying, okay, I have a game console and I turn it off when I'm not using it, and it's cool, whatever it's running, if I don't see the code. I totally get that. You know what? I have an Xbox. I don't have any of that code, but I shut that sucker down when I'm not using it. Now, my refrigerator, my toaster, my waffle iron, hell, my friggin' crock pot, they have IoT crock pots running Linux and all sorts of stuff. If I couldn't get access to the code, or if someone that I respected and trusted couldn't get access to it and verify it and audit that code, that would be terrifying to me. And part of what, from my standpoint, makes having Linux on those sorts of devices preferable over FreeBSD, even though technically, realistically, they probably could accomplish the same task in a lot of similar ways, is that they are required to show that code. And from a security standpoint, that's what would lean me towards Linux and all those things. Do you see that as a concern on the FreeBSD and with the BSD license side of things with IoT style devices, or is that not concerning to you?
I would say that my concerns about IoT are way beyond what we were just talking about.
I totally agree.
Honestly,
I agree. I do.
I do lots of work in the IoT space, and I spent 6 years building proprietary embedded systems. And, the idea that someone, actually, I know Vint surfed through ACM, and I told Vint, I'm like, IoT was a terrible idea, man. I don't know why you even told anyone to do this. Like, it's a terrible idea.
Shut up, Vint.
Yeah, really, seriously. The internet was sort of a mildly amusing idea, but the idea that everything's on it, no, that's bad.
The internet was a mildly amusing idea. I think someone needs to quote you on that. That needs to be a T-shirt.
A T-shirt at the next conference.
Yeah.
So I am definitely worried about IoT. I definitely see the point of view that says, well, with GPL, we'll be able to force the code out of them, et cetera, et cetera.
At least we can see.
But the fact is you won't, because I'll tell you where most of those are being made, and that's in a place that doesn't respect intellectual property rights.
That's a fair point.
B,
that is a fair point.
B, some Linuxes are very pure in that they will not allow blobs, right? And in FreeBSD, we totally allow blobs, right? The binary blobs thing.
Yeah.
In embedded devices, sure, you bring up an ARM board that's got the standard ARM distro, because these are all going to be ARM devices. We know that that's what's going to win, because Intel can't seem to make a small processor to save their lives. God, I can't wait for them to see this. But, they're going to be ARM processors.
That's right. They're all right down the street from me, so it shouldn't be.
That's true. They can probably hear you.
They probably can.
So, they're going to be an ARM board, but they're going to have specialized devices. And those, the drivers, which are really where the security problems are going to come in.
Yeah.
Those aren't going to be open source, right? Those are going to be owned by Huawei or whoever's got them. So right. I don't think it's a huge deal. I do want to see. I do think that open source. I do think open source generally, like not just FreeBSD versus Linux. I think the fact that these are built on source code bases that can be evaluated by independent security researchers, super important.
Here's why, and I totally hear what you're saying, but here's why I think everything you said was utter garbage.
Okay. We can finally disagree.
It's not about the fact that there's one or two vulnerabilities. It's the cumulative effect, right? It's kind of like when I go to the grocery store, I let myself occasionally eat a Pop-Tart. Pop-Tarts are friggin' delicious, especially the strawberry kind without the frosting. It's just the right level of sweetness. I also am a big fan of the chocolate fudge Pop-Tarts.
Chocolate fudge is good.
Oh, man, those are good. But here's the thing. I can have a Pop-Tart every now and then. It's no big deal. But if I only ate chocolate Pop-Tarts, then I've got a real problem on my hands. So that's the kind of thing I come up against. Yes, in an ideal world, there are no binary blobs. We can get, you and me can be like, we have a device right here. It is a toaster. I hold it in my hands. Behold, toaster. And I push a button on it and it just spits out a disk that said, here's the complete code for your toaster with every piece of firmware and everything. And we can check it all out and we can update it and stick it back in and be like, great, fix that toaster up nice and secure. That's a good ideal world. we're not in that world, there's going to be proprietary bits of firmware that we can't make do with, that we can't do anything with. There's going to be binary blobs, and it's going to drive people like me on the free software side a little bit crazy about it. But if we have the majority of the system, the majority of the stack is known to be open in a way that we can gain access to it, at the very least we know we can get it 97% secure. And yes, having 3% closed and potentially insecure and unauditable is a problem, just like if you have a house and one of your windows is unlocked, because then there is a way of entry for a burglar. It's still better than leaving your front door unlocked and wide open with a sign out front that says, I don't know, did I lock it? Probably not.
I may or may not be home.
Yeah, I may or may not be home. I'm probably not home. It's fine. Like, you know, the cumulative effect is a real thing. And so we want to make it as hard as possible to gain access to our systems, as hard as possible for someone to do something malicious to them. We're never going to secure it all the way. So, I mean, we don't even need to worry about that. It's just getting it as close as we can.
But I also think that 97% really overstates it. If you look at the code in any operating system, not just FreeBSD and Linux, almost all of the dangerous code and a lot of the code is hardware adaptation, right? I mean, the classic case of Windows vulnerabilities, let's talk about everyone's favorite operating system. They come through the device drivers. Like the original NT work done by Dave Cutler, right?
Yeah.
Who was an old tech guy, the new technology, right?
Technology.
That had really good protections, which slowed everything down. And so every device driver manufacturer was like, well, our video is really slow. We'd like to reach into the 0 ring and touch all the memory.
Right.
And so it's always the things that touch memory. It's always the things that are devices. The scheduler in Linux and the scheduler in FreeBSD is insignificant compared to the amount of code. Right. So
I agree.
I just don't think the GPLv2, or even if it was 3, whatever, I don't think any open or free, like open source or free software license is going to compel Joe Random, maker of ridiculous, stupid camera, do the right thing, right? I mean, like the Dyn DNS attack, right? Theoretically, we can get at all that source code. Didn't help us a damn bit.
No.
And it's only going to get worse, right? There are people out there, and I work with people, I have clients who I'm working with securing their IoT devices. They're at least trying. I would say that's 10% of the market, right? The people who are going to make $10 widgets that you plug into your internet because the widget, I don't know, makes your house smell nice or, flashes a blue light.
I am waiting for the Glade Linux powered air fresheners that are connected that I can pull up my iPhone and beep, 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 change it to Jasmine.
Exactly. They'll use Linux or FreeBSD and they'll disappear in 3 weeks.
Right.
So I just don't think I don't think that's a big enough difference to matter. I do think that IoT is a huge issue. I am happy when IoT people use open source because then I know that more eyes have looked at it.
More eyes are good, right? I mean, really, we're talking levels of gray here. I mean, either way, at least they're not using embedded Windows or something crazy like that. This is a distinct improvement. On a related note, I'm actually speaking at the Open IoT Summit in 2 weeks about exactly what we're talking about now, about how IoT is just going to destroy everything, basically, which I am hopeful that's going to be fun, and I hope I don't get lynched. One final thing, and then we'll head off, because I think this is very interesting. I'll tell you what. I will put FreeBSD, just straight up FreeBSD on my little Lenovo over here, and I'm just going to see how it goes. And, and I'll write up a little article for Network World or wherever. I'm just, here's how it went. Here's how it went. And if I get anything wrong, please feel free to yell at me and tell me what I got wrong, because all of my other BSD friends will absolutely do it, and the more the merrier. But here's the cool thing. Right now, as we're talking, this show is 1 hour and 14 minutes long. This show is called the Lunduke Hour. This is the first episode that has gone up to an hour. Every episode up until now is ranged between 35 and I think 57 minutes is where a lot of them end. So congratulations, my friend. George, you managed to get me talking enough to get the Lunduke Hour over an hour for the first
Wow.
time in American history. So
I'm happy to help.
that's damned exciting. Would you like to plug anything before I send us away? You got any books you want to talk about? Foundation-y stuff?
Foundation stuff. I mean, if people are interested, I always plug the project first. If people are interested in FreeBSD, freebsd.org. Come take a look at the website. You can download, VM images. If you don't want to commit a whole laptop, you can just run one of our pre-built virtualized images on any of whatever virtual technology you happen to run. FreeBSD Foundation, we're 501c3. We exist to support the project. That's what I do in my copious free time. Because I don't do enough FreeBSD.
Right.
And that's freebsdfoundation.org. So check it out.
Awesome. And you guys really do good work. And before I head off, because I like to get in the last word, you're totally wrong. The GPL is way better than the BSD. But otherwise, you guys do great work. So thank you again, George. And everyone, go check it out. And if not, I don't care. It's just FreeBSD. It's stupid anyway.
Yeah.